October 14, 1943. Sky of Schweinfurt, Germany. From the top of their closed cockpits, Luftwaffe pilots laughed. That was another morning of easy hunting. The American bombers trudged in tight formation, slow, heavy, and, most importantly, completely alone. Without fighter escort, the B-17s were predictable targets. General Hans Jaschonek had already declared, "Without fighters, they have no future." On that day, 77 bombers were shot down or destroyed on landing. For the Germans, it was simple mathematics and aerial fun. This confidence, however, had its days numbered. The laughter that echoed on Luftwaffe radios would be drowned out by something that had not yet arrived. What they called turkey shooting would prove to be the last moment of dominance in the heavens. In less than 4 months, an American machine would emerge with enough speed, range, and efficiency to turn hunters into hunted. Her name, P-51 Mustang. This documentary reconstructs with data, engineering, and strategic irony the day the skies changed owners. The story of when German doctrine found the limit of its logic, and the laughter disappeared forever. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any image. In just a single day, October 14, 1943, more than 600 American airmen were killed or captured. The skies of Germany became an execution ground, and the Luftwaffe celebrated. German doctrine stated precisely, no single-engine fighter could fly to Berlin, fight and back. And technically they were right, until they weren't. 4 months later, a new type of airplane would appear. Lighter, faster, more economical, and with enough reach to change everything. The Germans would see him arrive with surprise, and they would never see the moment when he decided to stay. If you value this type of technical and historical reconstruction, leave your like and subscribe. This helps this channel keep alive the stories that the war almost erased. At 10:17 a.m. on October 14, 1943, the first B-17s began crossing hostile airspace over Schweinfurt, Germany. They came in tight formation, columns of 4, surrounded by hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns. It was the second time that the Allies had tried to neutralize the ball-bearing factories that kept the German arms industry running. The targets were clear, strategic, but the path to them was a sentence. In all, 291 bombers left on that mission. By sunset, 60 were scattered in Bavarian fields and forests. Another 17 would land so damaged that they would be discarded. The clear blue sky over Germany turned black with smoke, metal, and bodies in free fall. It was the worst single-day loss for the U.S. 8th Air Force. The Germans didn't just celebrate, they baptized. They called it a turkey shoot, a predictable massacre, a target shooting game where American bombers were the prey flying in a row. The Luftwaffe did not win by luck. He won by doctrine. The Germans had made bomber interception a science. They knew exactly where to strike. The FW-190s and Bf-109s waited beyond the range of Allied fighters, protected by geography and fuel. They dove from the sun, attacked with precise gusts, and disappeared before the gunners had time to rotate their turrets. The Americans bet everything on defensive formations. 3-dimensional boxes of 18 to 21 aircraft with overlapping firing ranges. In theory, an impenetrable fortress. In practice, an illusion. German pilots had identified clear flaws, blind spots in the nose, limited supplies of ammunition, and most devastating of all, the human factor. When 8 German fighters came ahead at 600 miles per hour combined speed, reaction time was measured in seconds. Gunners missed, fired into the void, hesitated, and a second of hesitation at 25,000 feet was a sentence. More than 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured that Thursday. German intelligence documented every American loss accurately. They knew where formations broke, how many bombers retreated, and which groups did not return. It was mathematics applied to slaughter, and more than that, it was doctrinal pride. To the Luftwaffe, the Americans were simply defying physics. No single-engine fighter could fly from England to the German countryside, engage and back. The P-47s had the range to reach the border. The P-38s, despite the ambitious design, suffered from freezing controls and engine failures at high altitude. When the fighters turned home, the Germans armed themselves. The bombers followed alone. And it was at this point, the so-called golden moment, that the Luftwaffe attacked with full force. Germany's mistake was not in the data. I was in the belief that the data would never change. German doctrine had been based on static truths: limited reach, technical superiority, territorial control. They had won so many times, so easily, that they stopped imagining that anything different was possible, and the result was operational arrogance disguised as efficiency. General Adolf Galland described the situation clearly in his memoirs. We were not wrong until everything changed suddenly. But there was one statistic that the Germans completely ignored. While the Luftwaffe produced about 25,000 aircraft a year, the United States produced more than 96,000. In 1943 alone, America launched nearly 10,000 heavy bombers and more than 23,000 fighters. It was a rhythm that no other nation on the planet could even comprehend. If this scale surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because this is the root of the turning point that was about to happen. The Schweinfurt mission was not a miscalculation. It was a mirror of American doctrine at its limit. It represented the most that the United States could do with the resources it had up to that point. It was the end of the line of strategy without reach. But it was also the beginning of something new. The answer to October's humiliation wouldn't come with promises. It would come with aluminum, fuel, cutting-edge engineering, and a decision to double down on the impossible. While the Germans celebrated the ease of shooting down unprotected bombers in factories in Texas and California, the assembly line of an airplane that still had no definitive name, but which in a few months would become a legend, began. The Mustang already existed, but not in the way that would change the war. Its fuselage was sleek, but its engine still limited it, until two British engineers made a proposal to combine the American structure with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an unlikely merger that would result in a plane capable of crossing Europe, facing the best fighters in the Reich, winning and returning with fuel to spare. The Luftwaffe didn't know it, but that same October 1943, North American aviation had already completed testing of the first Merlin-powered Mustang, and the numbers scared even the designers. Superior range, top speed of 440 miles per hour, operating ceiling above 40,000 feet. And most importantly, enough autonomy to protect the bombers to Berlin and back. In January, they were still laughing. In February, they began to be suspicious. In March, they looked up at the sky and saw American fighter jets where they should never be. The turning point would not come with an official announcement. It would come with silence on the Luftwaffe radio, because the bombers now flew together, and the German hunters for the first time hesitated to climb. In the next part, we will learn about the technical and political origin of the P-51 Mustang, and to understand why the plane that broke the German doctrine was born from a British request and an American mistake. At the end of each mission, Luftwaffe pilots waited for the same moment with surgical precision. They called it the Goldene Stunde, the golden hour. It was the exact point at which the Allied fighters turned back. Without cover, the American bombers proceeded alone toward targets in the heart of the Reich. The mathematics was exact, the doctrine tested, and the results predictable. The Luftwaffe didn't just know the limitation of American fighters, it trusted it. The P-47 Thunderbolt, while rugged and with superior armament, was a fuel guzzler. With external tanks, it reached just over 370 miles in combat, enough to cross Germany's western border, but never to escort formations to Regensburg, Leipzig, or Berlin. The P-38 Lightning, a more ambitious attempt, suffered from mechanical failures at high altitudes. Its twin engines, as innovative as they were fragile, froze in the extreme cold of the European winter. Neither could keep up with the B-17s to the end, and this, to the end, was precisely the deadliest passage. The Germans knew this and structured their entire air defense around this equation. Luftwaffe airfields were positioned just beyond the limit of the estimated range of Allied fighters. That was where the squads waited. One by one, they took off, reached altitude, and entered the bomber stream just as the escort turned around. Commanders called this a tactical blind spot. For the Reich fighters, the sky was a trap that opened with the departure of the Thunderbolts. This vulnerability was no secret. It was known, documented, and ironically assumed to be permanent. American doctrine also accepted this limit. Therefore, it invested in formation density, defensive armament, and bombardment at altitude. The American faith resided in the mass, the German faith in precision. But while the Germans stayed true to their strategies, Believing that range was a natural limitation, the United States treated the problem as an engineering challenge. It was this difference in posture that opened the rift. The German mistake was not only in relying on geography, but in transforming a technical fact into doctrinal dogma. Not only did they think it unlikely that American fighters could ever exceed the 600, 700, or 800 kilometers escort, they found it inconceivable. And for this reason, they did not prepare for the hypothesis of a different scenario. They didn't invest in defense in depth. They did not create protocols for resistance on prolonged scales. They did not modernize their infrastructure because of the possibility of being hunted in their own skies. Germany's air fortress was built around the certainty that the enemy would never get far. And it was at this point that technical fragility became strategic weakness. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the discussions were different. In 1942, the United States was not just looking for more planes. They were looking for a new concept, a fighter with performance equal to or superior to the Germans, but with enough range to go to and from Berlin. It was a request that bordered on the absurd. No single-engine plane in the world had achieved anything close to this. The debate was technical but also symbolic, because creating a long-range fighter meant more than changing the arithmetic of air warfare. It meant destroying the backbone of German confidence. But the Luftwaffe, involved on multiple fronts, did not notice the signs. It continued to operate as if the central skies of Germany were an impassable wall. In 1943, its commanders were still talking about inviolable airspace. The plane, tank, and ammunition factories were deliberately positioned far from the coast, precisely because it was believed that no enemy force would be able to reach them with constant protection. It was a fortress built on the scarcity of others. General Josef Kammhuber, who commanded the German air defense network, was so confident in the established model that in July 1943 he declared, "It is not necessary to reinforce the interior. The problem is at the edges." This phrase, documented in the planning reports of the Luftwaffe, is today cited as a symbol of the doctrinal myopia that dominated the high commands of the Reich. They were stuck with a static idea of air warfare, a war that ended at the limits of American fuel. But America was not bound by those limits, and he did not see war as something static. It had been expanding its production capacity month by month. While the Germans debated tactical efficiency, the United States built factories that operated 24 hours a day, in 3 shifts, with 350,000 workers in the aviation sector alone. One of the directors of North American aviation in 1943 summed up the American spirit in one sentence: "If Germany has an equation, we have a problem." And problem here is synonymous with solution. This mentality would give birth to a different fighter, one that would not be designed from the question, what can be done with what we have, but from the question, what needs to be done and how will we do it? The Mustang was still a prototype with limited performance, but its lightweight fuselage, refined aerodynamics, and interior architecture suggested something promising. The marriage between the British Merlin engine and the body of the American NA-73X would create for the first time an airplane capable of flying deep, fighting hard, and coming back in one piece. And this is where the story changes tone. Because the Germans, stuck with numbers that seemed immutable, began to feel something different. In December 1943, during an intercept in northern France, a squadron of JG-26 reported a strange encounter. American single-engine fighters at 30,000 feet, maintaining formation with bombers until dispersion. The report was filed as an operational anomaly. In the next part, we will get to know this anomaly. The plane that the Germans thought was a radar error, the machine that took America all the way to Berlin and began to bury German confidence under a layer of smoke, steel, and surprise. Because what the Luftwaffe didn't know was that the Mustang was already in the sky. In April 1940, amid the escalation of the war in Europe, the British Purchasing Commission was desperately seeking reinforcements for its air units. The initial request was straightforward: more American-made Curtiss P-40 fighters to fill the gaps opened by mounting losses against the Luftwaffe. But the response they received from North American aviation was not a sale proposal. It was a challenge. Instead of producing more P-40s under license, the company proposed something that surprised even the British: to develop a new fighter from scratch, faster, more modern, and with the potential for expansion, and do it in just 120 days. It was an industrial gamble that few countries would dare to accept, but in the United States, the combination of ambition and manufacturing capacity was a quiet advantage. Thus was born the NA-73X project, the embryo of what would become the P-51 Mustang. The first prototype flew on October 26, 1940, just 5 months after the first technical drawing. It was an unthinkable feat by European standards of military development. With sleek lines, clean aerodynamics, and a lightweight frame, the NA-73X surprised with its stability and speed at low altitudes. But there was a clear limitation. The Allison V1710 engine, also used in the P-38 Lightning, did not offer adequate performance above 15,000 feet, just where the air war was being fought over Europe. In practice, it was a tactical fighter, not a strategic one, useful for reconnaissance, interdiction, and ground attack, but ineffective as a bomber escort at high altitudes. The transformation came from the other side of the Atlantic. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker had the opportunity to fly an Allison-powered Mustang. The assessment was immediate and definitive. The fuselage is superb. What is missing is power and height. Harker proposed installing the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same engine that equipped the Spitfire Mach-9 fighters. Adaptation tests began quickly, with collaboration between British and American engineers. In October of that same year, the first Mustang with a Merlin engine took off. Performance has changed radically. The top speed jumped to 440 miles per hour. The operating ceiling has risen to more than 40,000 feet, and most impressively, fuel efficiency remained high, ensuring unprecedented range for a single-engine fighter. This union of British engineering and American production marked a quiet turning point in the war. Germany, which saw itself as the epicenter of technological innovation, did not foresee that the answer to its supremacy would come from collaboration between democracies, and that this union would not only deliver a new plane, it would deliver a completely different air doctrine. Because the Mustang, unlike German fighters, was not designed to shine in aerobatic maneuvers or dominate local arenas. It is designed to be a strategic multiplier, a fighter that could fly farther, for longer, spending less and maintaining performance equal to or superior to the enemy in direct combat. The structure of the Mustang was simple, functional, and easy to produce. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag and improved fuel efficiency by up to 30%. The clean design allowed series operation without major adaptations. It was an airplane made to be built by the thousands, and it was. While the Luftwaffe struggled to deliver increasingly complex and expensive aircraft, the United States created a modular production system that allowed it to launch hundreds of Mustangs per month, with interchangeable parts and simplified maintenance. The Mustang's strength wasn't just in its engine or range, it was in the logic of its existence. He represented war as the Allies understood it, as an all-out industrial effort, where efficiency of design was part of the weapon. The German underestimation was twofold. First, by believing that the Americans would never get a long-range fighter. Second, by imagining that, even if they did, they would not have the scale to produce and maintain the operation long enough. German doctrine was based on the elite, the skill of veteran aces piloting technically refined machines. But the Mustang belonged to another school. It was standardized, massive, reliable. Germany bet on superior quality, but ignored the power of a good enough quantity multiplied by thousands. In terms of value for money, the P-51 was devastating. Cheaper than the P-47, lighter, with a range more than twice that of a Bf-109 with external tanks, and with similar or superior performance in speed and maneuverability above 20,000 feet. In a war where every plane lost had to be replaced quickly, the Mustang represented a logical, arithmetic choice. And of course, America won that bill. When the first P-51Bs arrived in England in November 1943, the Luftwaffe did not yet know them. They didn't know their data. They did not know their limits. But within a few weeks, the learning curve would become painful. And by the time German intelligence finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The enemy they believed to be technically limited had designed and delivered a solution that would change the entire air war. In the next part, we will see how the first Mustangs began to fly real missions over French and German territory, and how did the Luftwaffe pilots react when they realized that the bombers, they were no longer alone. The transformation of war in the skies of Europe came not in a sudden roar, but in the aerodynamic whisper of a wing. Created by engineer Edgar Schmude, an Austrian-born American immigrant, the P-51 Mustang's laminar flow wing seemed like just one more technical detail among many. But this engineering decision changed the course of the war. By reducing drag at high speeds and redistributing pressure on the wing surface, Schmude created something the Luftwaffe lacked: a fast, stable, low-fuel fighter with unforeseen range. While the heavy P-47 Thunderbolt consumed more than 100 gallons of fuel per flight hour, the Mustang operated with only 65. This efficiency, combined with the British Merlin engine and external tanks under the wings, gave the Mustang a range of more than 850 nautical miles, enough to cross France, reach Berlin, fight and return with fuel to spare. For the first time in history, a single-engine fighter could fly alongside the bombers to the end and win. The effect of this technical feat was multiplying. Beginning in December 1943, the first Mustangs began to be integrated into the 354th Fighter Group, assigned to escort the B-17s over northern France. The initial missions were still experimental, but the results were immediate. Fewer losses, greater penetration, bomber pilots who returned alive, and a new sensation on Luftwaffe radios: silence. By January 1944, the Germans had already noticed. The JG-11 and JG-26 reports pointed to the presence of a new single-engine aircraft with performance similar to ours, but with prolonged behavior in the combat zone. This, for the German commanders, was an alarm signal. They knew what it meant. If the bombers were now protected to their target, the window of attack, the so-called golden moment, had evaporated. The fighter doctrine of opportunity, which had underpinned the Reich's air defense since 1940, was being dismantled, not by a ground offensive nor by massive bombardments, but by a light, silent, and increasingly numerous fighter. The irony of this story is that the solution has always been before them. The Germans themselves had tested aerodynamic efficiency concepts in the late 1930s, but abandoned it in favor of armor, raw power, and speed over short distances. The Luftwaffe prioritized maneuverability and firepower, while the Allies, pressed by the distances of the European theater, were forced to think about range, consumption, and endurance. The war shaped the technical thinking of each side. Germany projected for local dominance. The United States projected for global persistence, and the Mustang was the ultimate proof of that mentality. Within months, Mustangs went from being promising prototypes to the backbone of the new American air doctrine. Renamed the P-51B and then the P-51D, with a bubble cockpit and better rear visibility, the plane was adopted by dozens of fighter squadrons. Its psychological effect was as important as its tactical impact. Bomber pilots, once accustomed to seeing P-47s turn around past the German border, now had constant escort to the target and back. Loss rates began to fall. Operational confidence grew, and the Luftwaffe pilots, once arrogant, began to hesitate. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how technical details change the course of the war, show your support. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue bringing real stories, with precision and respect for the complexity of the events. The laminar flow wing, the British engine, the American airframe, it all converged on a single conclusion. The Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It was a flying strategic platform, able to adapt, sustain pressure, and operate economically. Germany, for its part, was beginning to feel the weight of its own doctrinal rigidity. Their fighters were excellent within their limits, but the Mustangs were redrawing the very boundaries of warfare. And that's how, quietly, hunters began to be hunted. In the next part, we'll look at how the Mustang turned the tables in mid-air, and how, in a few months, German pilots went from dominating to survivors. Because from 1944 onwards, the skies of the Reich were never the same. On the freezing morning of December 1st, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group took off from Boxted Air Force Base in England on a mission that, at first glance, seemed routine, escorting a formation of B-17 bombers to industrial facilities in northern France. The weather was clear, the target was known, and the tactic, flying as far as the fighters could, turning before risk, and hoping the bombers survived the final stretch, was the same as it had been for months. But there was an invisible variable in the sky that day. For the first time, the escort planes were not P-47s. They were P-51B Mustangs. New, shiny, lighter, quieter, and with extra tanks full of fuel. That would be the first real combat mission with the Mustang operating in a strategic role, not only as an interceptor, but as a persistent sentinel. The goal was not just to arrive, it was to stay. During the first legs of the mission, the Luftwaffe reacted as usual. Fast takeoffs, interception vectors, coordinated dives. But something strange happened at 10:42 a.m. when the bombers crossed the 400-mile mark. The escort fighters continued alongside. On German radio, confusion began to spread. The turrets reported fighter formations still next to the bombers in exclusion space. The first JG-26 fighters that went up to intercept expected to find only the B-17s, but they saw dark spots ahead, in tight formation, covering each flank of the bombers. Pilot Walter Dahl, a veteran of the Russian front, described the moment as a reconnaissance error. He believed he was facing P-47s with extra tanks. It attacked, fired, but was surprised by a fighter that climbed on its rear with power and maneuverability that did not match the Thunderbolt. On landing, he informed, they didn't turn, they waited. German reports that week began to record an unexpected pattern. American fighters that stayed in combat longer than usual, that maneuvered as single-engine but operated as twin-engine in terms of range. Luftwaffe analysts thought of a variation of P-38, of new fuel adaptations, of suicidal strategies. But no hypothesis explained what they were seeing, and no one, until then, imagined that the Americans had quietly introduced a new fighter, invisible to the eyes of traditional doctrine. The Mustang was not yet recognized as a threat, but it was already altering the way Germans flew. Throughout December 1943, the pioneer Mustangs of the 354th Group began to fly deeper. Initially, the missions crossed the Channel and returned before the 500-mile mark. But with the 75-gallon external tanks and logistical improvements at Allied bases, the effective range exceeded 850 miles, enough to reach the outskirts of Frankfurt, then Leipzig, and finally in February the routes leading to Berlin. The Luftwaffe could not understand how a single-engined aircraft, flying at more than 30,000 feet, could maintain bomber formation, fight Bf-109s, and still have fuel to return. Interrogations of captured pilots revealed phrases such as, "He was there at the beginning, and he was still there when I ran out of ammunition." It was the beginning of a slow and psychological erosion. The logic that underpinned the German tactic, waiting for the escort to turn, attacking the blind spot, no longer worked. But the generals of the Reich still did not want to accept it. They still saw heaven as their natural domain. They still relied on their numbers, their rotating formations, their radar network and forward fields. They still believed that bombers could not survive the depth. But the depth now had teeth. The impact of these first missions was not only operational, it was moral. Luftwaffe pilots began to hesitate. They started climbing later, calculating more waiting time, avoiding mass attacks in areas where they were not sure what awaited them. And more than that, they began to speak. German radio, once used to coordinate fighter jets, began to record complaints, surprise confessions, warnings of invisible fighters, and suspicions of technical espionage. Absolute confidence, a hallmark of the years of aerial blitzkrieg, gave way to a silent annoyance. The enemy was changing, and they didn't know how. And it wasn't just in the air. North Americans' factories in the United States were now in full production. A Mustang rolled off the assembly line every 66 minutes. What the Germans thought was an isolated mistake was actually the beginning of a tide. In the first 3 months of 1944, more than 1,000 Mustangs arrived in Europe, each of them with autonomy, range, and aggressiveness to change the battlefield. The Luftwaffe was still flying, but it was beginning to bleed, and what seemed like a tactical advantage was becoming a cycle of attrition. Combat after combat, veteran aces fell, and in their place came young, poorly trained pilots, thrown into the fire against an enemy who could now wait. In the next part, we will see the day when the last certainty of the Luftwaffe fell, the day the Mustangs crossed the sky of Berlin for the first time. Because the air war wasn't just changing, it was being rewritten line by line with every flight that went and came back. At dawn on March 4, 1944, dense silence blanketed the runways of England as the crews of the 8th Air Force prepared for the most daring mission ever planned. The target was not a factory, nor an airfield or a railway station. It was Berlin, the political, symbolic, and psychological heart of the Third Reich, the city that Hermann Göring, Marshal of the Luftwaffe, had sworn that he would never see an enemy bomb fall on him as long as he was alive. An oath that would now be contradicted by 660 B-17 bombers, flying in close formation, escorted, for the first time, by fighters that would not retreat. The order was clear. The Mustangs will go all the way. It was more than a mission. It was a statement. At 8:40 a.m., the first formations began to cross the North Sea. The sky was clear, the visibility perfect. From German soil, radar picked up the approach, and the Luftwaffe went on high alert. The bases at Rechlin, Verneuchen, Jüterbog, and Oranienburg were ordered to intercept them completely. It was a chance to defend the capital and reaffirm the doctrine of air inviolability. The German drivers climbed confidently. They had faced heavy formations before, but soon something changed in the combat pattern. Above the B-17s and also on the sides, there was a new layer of protection, single-engine fighters, many, maneuvering with precision, responding to attacks before the Bf-109s or Fw-190s were able to get into position, and the worst, by staying. The sight of American fighter jets over Berlin was more than surprising. It was disorienting. German radios exploded with requests for reinforcement, for retreat, for clarification. On the ground, commanders tried to understand whether they were dealing with new planes, prototypes, or suicide strategies. The truth was simpler and more devastating. The P-51 Mustangs had crossed the line, the limit of fuel, of reach, of doctrine, and of the Reich's own arrogance. They were in Berlin, and they were winning. In the cockpit of the Mustang Scat-6, then Captain Chuck Yeager later described the mission as a direct flight into German myth. He and his squadron of the 357th Fighter Group shot down 5 enemy fighters before the bombers even crossed the Elbe. There was no hesitation. The Mustangs dived, engaged, and returned to formation within minutes. It was a choreography of aerial precision never seen before over German territory. The bombers, once condemned to solitude in the depths of the Reich, now flew tooth and eye. From the ground, civilians watched in disbelief as the roar of engines streaked through the skies of the capital. It was not a swift wave, like the British night raids. It was a prolonged, calculated, strategic presence. The bombs fell on industrial targets, railway stations, armament workshops. But the deeper damage wasn't physical, it was moral. The idea that the German sky was an impenetrable shield had been torn apart, and torn apart by planes that shouldn't be there. For Luftwaffe officers, the March 4 mission represented a complete break. They didn't just lose fighter jets, they lost confidence in their defense network. For the first time, internal reports acknowledged that American fighters were operating in zones previously considered unreachable. The doctrine of the stepped defense, based on the early return of the enemy escort, was no longer valid. And without this doctrine, there was no plan B. General Adolf Galland, in a private conference with Göring, was categorical. If they can escort to Berlin, we have lost the advantage. It's a different war now. Mustangs didn't just arrive. They proved that they could come back. Each plane that returned to bases in England carried with it the message that German doctrine had been surpassed, not by quantity but by strategic quality applied at scale. And this scale would only increase. In April, there would be more than 1,000 Mustangs operating in Europe. In June, more than 2,000. And each week, more German pilots disappeared from the sky, and fewer came back to explain why. But the March 4 mission was more than a military milestone. It was a message, a response to the contempt, underestimation, and arrogant belief that America was too big to be efficient and too young to be strategic. Germany had bet on the enemy's restraint, and now the enemy flew over his capital with confidence, precision, and permanence. In the next part, we'll explore the days after the attack on Berlin, and how the Luftwaffe began to crumble under the weight of its own doctrine, facing an adversary that was no longer just technological, but morally superior. Because what fell in Berlin that day were not just bombs, it was the myth of invincibility. With the Berlin sky broken and German doctrine exposed, Mustangs were no longer just escorts, they became predators. Air warfare, until then centered on the protection of bombers, would radically change direction. In March 1944, General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, authorized the most aggressive alteration of combat doctrine since the beginning of operations over Europe. Fighters would no longer fly alongside bombers in a defensive position. Now, his mission was to hunt, find, engage, and destroy any enemy aircraft before they even take to the skies. The Mustang would become not just a shield, but a spear, and the Luftwaffe, cornered and outclassed, would begin to bleed in its own home. The new doctrine was put into practice with surgical precision, using information from air intelligence, radio intercepts, and photographic reconnaissance. P-51 squadrons began directing attacks directly at Luftwaffe bases. German fighters were shot down in a row before taking off. Hangarettes were destroyed with low-flying attacks. Maintenance shops, fuel depots, tanker trucks, everything became a priority target. Hunters now hunted in the cradle of hunting, and the psychology of combat has changed. German pilots began to take off knowing that they might not encounter bombers, but they would be found. The effect was immediate and brutal. Between March and May 1944, the number of Luftwaffe losses rose exponentially. In April, on the Western Front alone, 1,298 German fighters were shot down. In the same period, the Americans lost 400 aircraft, mostly bombers. The disproportion became untenable for the Reich. Unlike the United States, which produced more than 2,000 fighters a month, Germany struggled to deliver 500, often with pilots without complete training. It was a war of attrition that the Luftwaffe had no way of winning. And more than that, it was a war against time. With each Mustang that landed intact, a new pilot gained experience. For every German ace lost, a decade of knowledge was buried. Factual moment. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. Germany, that same year, manufactured just over 3,000 Bf-109s, and most of them with compromised quality. A logistical, industrial, and technological abyss that no individual heroism could fill. If this statistic surprised you, comment below with absolute power, unbelievable, or logistics wins. Your support helps us to continue revealing what the numbers hide. The impact of this air offensive was not limited to fighter units. German railways began to be systematically attacked. The Mustangs, now with autonomy for low-altitude patrols, destroyed locomotives, convoys, trucks, and supply trains. Production lines that still survived the night bombardments of the British were disrupted during the day by the precision of Allied fighters. It was a constant pressure, uninterrupted. An invisible presence, but always imminent. The accounts of German workers show the psychological effect of this siege. In many regions, working near factories has become a death sentence. Every noise in the sky could be the last. The doctrine of stepped defense, one of the Reich's last hopes for air resistance, collapsed. Outfields, once considered rapid response zones, have become priority targets. The average time between takeoff alert and engagement dropped to less than 6 minutes. This meant that many German fighters could not even reach operational altitude before being intercepted. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, but increasingly, it was fighting to survive, not to win. And yet, the American machine continued to expand. While the Germans rationed aluminum and cut cadet flight hours for lack of fuel, the Americans trained thousands of pilots at bases in Texas, California, and Florida. On the ground, North American operated with 3 daily shifts. The Mustang was produced as a consumer good, standardized, optimized, cheap, and lethal. The logic was simple. A fighter that cost less, flew more, spent less, and earned more. In a theater of war where every second cost lives, this equation proved unbeatable. The change was also cultural. The American pilot was no longer seen as inexperienced or submissive to the formation. With the Mustang, he gained decision-making autonomy, firepower, and the ability to engage freely. The mentality has changed, from protecting to pursuing, from resisting to annihilating. It was a moral transformation as great as it was tactical. The sky, which once belonged to Germany, became part of time, and time was on the side of the Allies. In the next part, we will see the final effect of this air encirclement, how the fall of the Luftwaffe did not begin in one major battle, but in 1,000 silent cuts, and how the constant presence of Mustangs prepared the ground for what would come next, the inevitable invasion. Because before the soldiers touched European soil, America had already conquered the air. Between January and March 1944, the Luftwaffe began to disappear, not in a single day nor in a single battle, but in a slow evaporation of talent, doctrine, and hope. In just 3 months, more than 5,500 German pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. Most didn't die in epic clashes in the skies over Berlin. They died trying to take off, trying to get back, trying to understand how a once predictable enemy had become ubiquitous. It was the collapse of a system based on individual excellence, suffocated by a machine that prioritized volume, standard, and efficiency. The Mustang, now in full operational domain, flew with gyroscopic sights, extended autonomy, and a lightweight structure. His ability to aim even at complex turn angles turned aerial combat into mathematics. German superiority, once based on reflexes and maneuvers, was no longer enough. The average flight hours of a new German pilot had dropped to less than 160. In the United States, cadets completed more than 350 hours before crossing the Atlantic. And that was just the beginning. While the Luftwaffe improvised emergency programs to replace dead aces, the U.S. trained 11,000 new pilots a month. Germany was no longer able to replace its aircraft, its engines, or its fuel tanks. But what she could no longer replace, and what cost the most, were her men. Each lost pilot took with him years of experience, and left in his place a hurried, frightened, ill-prepared boy. It was no longer uncommon to see entire squadrons being shot down in minutes by American pilots with less wartime, but much more flight time. The statistic that most haunted the German generals was not the number of planes shot down. It was the survival rate of the rookies. By March 1944, a new Luftwaffe pilot had a life expectancy of less than 30 days of combat, and on certain fronts that number dropped to less than 2 weeks. Heaven, once a field of honor, had become an industrial grinder. German tactical superiority, based on legendary aces such as Galland, Barkhorn, or Hartmann, could not be multiplied, and the Americans knew it. For every 5 German fighters shot down, the Allies lost 1. The relationship was unsustainable, and every day the ratio leaned even more towards the side of Mustangs. The irony was brutal. The country that laughed at American bombers for flying unescorted now saw its own pilots fly without support. The Luftwaffe formations, disorganized, flew as they could. Many left without cover, without coordination, without chance. Air superiority was no longer a contest. It was a fact. And more than that, it was a direct reflection of replacement capacity, because in the end the air war was not just fought by those who were in the air, but by those who could get men in the air every day. Germany, with its technical pride and its obsession with perfection, has never prepared for a war of attrition. America, with its logistical pragmatism, has built a machine for just that. The Mustang became the symbol of this turnaround. It was not the most armed fighter, nor the most armored, but it was the most intelligent. In cost-effectiveness, no Allied aircraft surpassed it. Produced at scale, easily maintained, adapted quickly. It was the right answer to the kind of war the Luftwaffe didn't want to believe it was fighting. A war of attrition, a war of rhythm, a war in which statistics were more lethal than talent, and the numbers didn't stop. In June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, the Luftwaffe was barely able to muster 200 operational fighters on the Western Front. The Allies had more than 1,800 in England alone. On some missions, P-51s operated in squadrons larger than the entire Reich fighter force in that region. What began as a technical response to a limitation of range had become a large-scale aerial annihilation operation. And Germany, once the owner of the skies, now saw its pilots die without even knowing who they were fighting against. In the next part, we will look at how this aerial collapse not only facilitated the invasion of Normandy, but prepared the way for a new kind of warfare. A war in which soldiers were already landing in territory where the enemy had no eyes, no wings. Because when the Mustangs took over the sky, the earth was free for the impossible. From the spring of 1944, what had once been unshakable confidence among Luftwaffe pilots began to turn to silence. A thick silence, made up of stares avoided in the tents, trembling hands when fastening seatbelts, brief and censored letters hurriedly sent home. The greatest damage done by the Mustangs was not visible in reports of aircraft destruction or equipment losses. It was psychological, subterranean, and progressive. Men trained to believe in the superiority of the Luftwaffe began to fear the sky. What was once a hunting ground has become an invisible graveyard, and death now came from all sides. Without warning, without glory. The letters intercepted by the German High Command began to show the fracture. "They are everywhere, even when we don't see them," wrote one JG-3 pilot. "We don't know if we're back alive anymore, even if we didn't fight," wrote another. The censors, pressured to maintain the morale of the troops, ordered the destruction of hundreds of these messages, but the content had already been read. It had already been felt. The Mustangs were winning before they even fired. They were winning in the space between the radio and the heartbeat. They were winning by making elite pilots fly in fear of being seen, before they even saw the enemy. Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran with more than 170 confirmed victories, wrote in his memoirs that the problem was no longer technical, it was spiritual. We still knew how to fly, but we didn't know why. His phrase epitomized the disconnect between technical pride and tactical reality. German bases were being bombed, hangars destroyed, runways rutted, and still, pilots took off. But they took off without faith, because they knew that at any moment, even in the final minute of the mission, they could be surprised by a shadow overhead, a P-51 waiting for the right moment. Erich Schuck, another experienced pilot, reported the change in the squadron's behavior. "We no longer talked about shooting down enemies. We talked about coming back alive. The silence before takeoff was the worst, because we all knew what was coming." It describes a mission in which 3 fighters took off to intercept a formation of bombers. Only he returned. There was no real combat. We were caught still climbing. A Mustang passed me so fast that I barely had time to react. It was like being struck by lightning. The numerical superiority, previously advantageous to Germany, had been reversed. And with it, confidence. The fear was no longer of dying. It was to die without a fight. Mustangs flew on rotating patrols covering vast areas of airspace. Its pilots, well-fed, well-trained, and rotated between missions, operated with a steady advantage. Meanwhile, Germans, exhausted, overworked, and increasingly young, flew up to 3 times a day. Fatigue became as lethal as the enemy, and this mental exhaustion contaminated the mission reports. We couldn't identify the enemy. The escort is present before the arrival of the bombers. The takeoff is being watched from the air. Lines like these began to be repeated in practically all regions of the Western Front. Even the aces began to hesitate. Adolf Galland, one of the biggest names in the Luftwaffe, confessed after the war. The Mustang was not just a fighter. It was an industrial statement, a demonstration that Germany had lost the dominance of innovation. We couldn't compete anymore. The German perception, built over the years on the idea of technological and tactical superiority, was dismantled by an airplane that embodied the opposite idea: efficiency over elegance, production over prestige, precision over instinct. And when that realization fell, it took with it something more dangerous: faith. The Luftwaffe, a force that once represented the pinnacle of engineering and operational discipline, has become a haunted troop. The statistics began to reflect this. By May 1944, the combat evasion rate, pilots who retreated before engaging, exceeded 40% in some squadrons, a rate unthinkable 2 years earlier. The laughter of the turkey shot had turned into superstition. Many pilots began to avoid flying on missions poorly aligned with the wind. Others preferred transfers to land roles. What the Luftwaffe didn't say openly, but everyone knew, was that the Mustang had won where fear sets in the silence before battle. And the most ironic thing, Germany never believed that this was possible. From the earliest days of the war, he trusted that his dominance in the skies was unquestionable, that his rigid training and technical excellence would be sufficient to hold off any Allied advance. But the enemy that arrived was not just technical, it was mental. It was logistical, moral, psychological. The Mustang, designed to keep up with bombers, became a shadow in the German consciousness, a speedy ghost that not only shot down planes, but corroded the soul of those who still flew them. In the next part, we will see how this mental defeat began to materialize on the ground. Because the psychological warfare waged in the clouds was not restricted to the air. It came down, infiltrated the trenches, the radios, the train stations, and it paved the way for the total downfall of a force that one day believed to be invincible. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, the skies over Germany became a death trap. The official name was Operation Argument, but history would record it as Die große Woche, the Big Week. 6 days of massive bombing, organized not only to destroy strategic targets, but to dismantle once and for all the backbone of the Luftwaffe. The declared focus was on the German aircraft industry, airframe factories, engines, spare parts. But the real goal was not on the ground. It was on the air. The main targets were pilots, and the Mustang's mission was clear: to hunt, not protect, to initiate a process of aerial extermination that would leave no room for recovery. The offensive began with surgical precision. In Augsburg, the Messerschmitt factories. In Leipzig, the engines of Junkers. In Regensburg, the lines of the Bf-109. The U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF combined forces to launch more than 3,800 sorties on the first day alone. But it was on the way back, in the air corridors between the targets and the Allied bases, that the Mustangs revealed themselves. They didn't just keep up with the bombers. They overtook them, dived, tracked them. They encountered the FW-190s and Bf-109s before they could form squadrons. They attacked in formation, then alone, then in pairs. Hunting had become systematic. Every Mustang in the air flew with autonomy to decide and attack. Every encounter was an ambush. The Luftwaffe tried to react. Hoping to contain the massacre, he formed special units known as Sturmgruppen, assault groups. They were made up of modified FW-190s with extra armor plates, heavy armament, and a new doctrine: fly straight to the bombers, shoot as much as they could, and, if necessary, crash. The concept was brutal, but the execution was tragic. The planes, heavy and slow, became perfect targets for Mustangs. In a single day, the 357th Fighter Group shot down 18 Sturmgruppe FW-190s in less than 20 minutes. The Luftwaffe's desperate tactics became predictable, and the Americans were prepared for each of them. The Reich Air Force was no longer able to defend its own airspace. In many regions, the P-51s operated with complete freedom. German planes attempting to climb to meet the bombers were attacked while still in ascent formation. At some bases, pilots were hit before they even put on their seatbelts. It was a war fought with millimeter precision, based on signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, and logistical planning. And most devastatingly, it was a war that the Germans could no longer follow. Not in number, not in time, not in morals. During the Great Week, more than 600 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed. But the most painful number was another. Approximately 400 experienced pilots died or were captured, and each of them was, in practice, irreplaceable. In response, the Reich hastened the training of young recruits, reducing instruction time to less than 100 hours of flight time. The result was predictable: new aircraft in the hands of inexperienced pilots, pitted against an air force that had already mastered all aspects of combat: tactical, technical, and psychological. Meanwhile, American production showed no signs of slowing down. North American factories operated day and night, with tripled shifts, delivering hundreds of Mustangs a week. The fuel came from the fields of Louisiana, the pieces from California, Kansas, Ohio. At no time was the supply line interrupted. America's air war was also a war of management, and its efficiency made innovation a constant. Every P-51 that flew was a reminder that Germany had underestimated more than one plane. It underestimated a culture that, when challenged, responded not with rhetoric, but with scale. General Doolittle, at the end of the operation, declared that air dominance was no longer an objective, it was a reality, and German reports, for the first time, began to avoid the use of the word victory. Terms such as containment, postponement, and partial resistance came to dominate internal Luftwaffe communications. Language itself had surrendered, and with it, the future of Reich air defense. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: Germany believed it had foreseen all possible scenarios of the air war, but he did not foresee the simplest. He did not foresee that when faced with technical impossibility, America would respond with logistical solution, that in the face of a range limitation, a plane would emerge that would not only overcome this barrier, but annihilate those who believed it was permanent. During the Great Week, the sky ceased to be a space for confrontation and became the symbol of a sealed destiny. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated. It had been decommissioned, piece by piece, wing by wing, pilot by pilot. In the next part, we will see how this aerial annihilation created the conditions for the decisive moment of the war, D-Day. Because before the first Allied boot touched the beaches of Normandy, the Mustangs had already cleared the sky for history to descend. The German response came late, and it came in desperation. When Mustangs were already dominating the skies of Europe, the Reich finally unveiled its secret weapons: the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter and the Me-163 Comet manned rocket. They were impressive machines. The Me-262, with a speed of more than 850 km/h, was the world's first operational jet. The Me-163, propelled by rocket engines, broke the 950 km/h barrier in vertical climbs. In theory, these aircraft could change air warfare. In theory, because in practice the mathematics of war had already been defined by industry, and Germany could no longer keep up. The Me-262s required long, perfectly level runways, which by 1944 were under constant bombardment. Each time a new base was prepared, the Mustangs found it, and they destroyed it. The image of a parked Me-262 was enough for an entire squadron of American fighters to be directed to the site. The Luftwaffe attempted to protect them with anti-aircraft artillery and takeoff operations under cover, but it was no use. The Allied response time was shorter than the German taxiing time. Many Me-262s were destroyed while still on the ground, without ever having fought. Those that did manage to take off flew like ghosts, too fast to engage in dogfights, too slow in turns, fragile on landing. They had speed, but they had no scenery. Fuel was another ghost. In 1943, Germany produced about 6.5 million tons of oil per year. By 1944, that number had plummeted to less than 2 million, and it would continue to fall. Meanwhile, the United States produced 240 million tons of oil products per year, a difference that made any comparison ridiculous. In practical numbers, for every liter of fuel that the Luftwaffe could deliver to an Me-262, the Americans fueled 50 Mustangs. I repeat, 50. And if this statistic impresses you, leave a short phrase in the comments, something like absolute power or logistics wins, because it sums up the essence of this war. The pilots were also missing. The Me-262 required a completely new flight pattern. It wasn't an airplane, it was a technology. And like all technology, it required mastery, repetition, adaptation. But the men who could learn to master it were already dead. What little time of instruction remained was devoted to basic familiarization. Many pilots flew their jets for the first time in combat, and Mustangs, by contrast, were flown by men with hundreds of hours in actual combat. The duel was so asymmetrical that it didn't even deserve the name of duel. It was an execution with spectacle. Adolf Galland, now transferred to the Jet Elite, described in his diary the first mission with the Me-262. "We flew like arrows, but we fell like hammers. When we tried to return to base, we were surrounded. Hundreds of wolves. The Mustangs were no longer just escorting. They were hunting, and hunting smartly. The Me-262 was too fast to pick up in a straight line, but vulnerable when taking off or landing. The Americans soon understood this pattern and began to attack precisely at these moments. The order was clear: don't fight the jet in the air, kill it on the ground. And so they did. The Me-163 Comet, meanwhile, was a prodigy of extreme engineering. It climbed faster than any other aircraft of the war, but I only had a few minutes of autonomy. After the rocket's thrust, it became a defenseless glider. Its landing, without an engine, was a risky operation. And because it couldn't be safely fueled, the explosive compounds used self-ignited on contact with the air. Many pilots died before they even took off. It was called the suicide plane of engineering. And it was abandoned before it even went into large-scale production. Germany was betting on miracle weapons because it could no longer rely on any other resource. Production collapsing, railway lines disrupted, morale destroyed. And meanwhile, the Americans produced about 26,000 Mustangs. Each week, a new generation of pilots was formed. Each month, a new strategy was developed. And with each mission, the Luftwaffe lost more than planes. It lost its reason. Because even the best jets in the world can't fly if there is no runway, fuel, maintenance, logistics, and men to operate them. The Mustang, on the other hand, did not need miracles. I needed routine. And this, the U.S. knew how to deliver better than any nation at war. By 1945, the Allies no longer counted downed jets as a major threat. The Mustangs took turns over the known Me-262 bases, waiting for the slightest sign of activity. When the radar detected movement, the attack was coordinated. In less than 2 minutes, the air was filled with 50 shells, and the track turned to ashes. Most of the destroyed Me-262s never had a chance to engage. The plane that could change the war was defeated by a weapon that the Germans believed to be technically inferior. And that was the final mistake, confusing innovation with timing. Germany innovated, yes, but when there was no time for anything. In the next part, we will reveal how this invisible war, of logistics, of routine, of pace, set the stage for the total collapse of the Reich. Because while the German jets burned on the ground, the real engine of defeat was already roaring on the other side of the Atlantic. And he didn't have to fly to win. It was enough to continue producing. War has its sharpest ironies when respect comes after silence. Throughout 1944 and 1945, not only operational data or tactical complaints appear among the Luftwaffe records, but phrases that, although veiled, border on admiration. The once underrated machine, seen as just one fighter among many, had become a symbol of ruin. Mustangs, initially mistaken for P-47s or underestimated as support fighters, now appeared in German officers' journals with another tone, that of forced reverence. The most remembered and perhaps most bitter phrase would come from Hermann Göring, Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe. "When I saw Mustangs flying over Berlin, I knew the game was over." It was not just a tactical observation. It was the recognition that the symbol of the inviolability of the Reich had been broken by an American single engine created for escort. In several interrogations conducted after the surrender, veteran Luftwaffe pilots cite the P-51 not only as an excellent fighter, but as the ideal enemy, an opponent who emerged with precision, who attacked efficiently, and who, unlike other models, seemed to think. "The Mustang didn't fly. He chose where to be," said Johannes Steinhoff in an interview decades later. The respect was technical. There was no romanticism, no nostalgia. There was only the harsh recognition that, contrary to the German belief in absolute aeronautical superiority, the war had shown another logic, that of production, of consistency, of adaptation. And the Mustang was the physical manifestation of that logic. In 1985, during a meeting between veterans in Reims, France, legendary American pilot Bud Anderson, of the 357th Fighter Group, met with former German opponents. Among them were names like Walter Schuck and Günther Rall. The conversation, recorded in audio and transcribed years later, oscillated between memory and technique. In a remarkable moment, Rall comments, "We knew that if we saw a Mustang, we were dealing with a driver who would not make basic mistakes. They flew as if they had a living manual in their heads. There was no direct compliment, but there was pattern recognition. The Germans, masters of single-player combat, were forced to deal with a machine made to negate just that, the classic duel. The Mustang did not fight as a rider. It fought like a swarm. Even the statistics confessed this respect. In 1944, of the 12,000 Allied planes lost in aerial combat, only 2,400 were Mustangs, despite flying more missions and penetrating deeper into enemy territory than any other fighter. This survival rate, combined with offensive effectiveness, put the P-51 in a category of its own, and the Luftwaffe knew it. The frequency with which German reports mentioned persistent Mustangs grew exponentially. They were no longer just escorts, they were hunters. And by recognizing this, the Germans definitively buried the doctrine of air combat that they had built since the Spanish Civil War. The symbology was not limited to the battlefield. The bombings escorted to Berlin carried ideological weight. Göring had promised in 1939 that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over the Reich capital. By March 1944, hundreds of bombers were doing just that, escorted by Mustangs that fought and returned with a margin of fuel. Göring's phrase became an epitaph, not of a strategy, but of a mentality. The Mustang's presence over Berlin was more than military. She was philosophical. It represented the definitive entry of the industrial war against the ideological war, from practical engineering against doctrinal pride. This silent respect has crossed generations. In post-war interviews, many German pilots reported that they preferred to find Spitfires or P-47s. The Mustang was difficult to predict. He showed up where he shouldn't have been and stayed where he wasn't expected. This came from the lethal combination of range, efficient cruising speed, and balanced armament. But it came, above all, from the American doctrine of air combat that the Mustang consolidated: surgical strike, depth cover, and psychological mastery. It was the opposite of the German doctrine of lightning offensive and isolated tactical superiority. And this contrast, which was previously despised, began to be studied. Even German engineers, such as Willy Messerschmitt, belatedly recognized that the real mistake of the Reich was to believe that it would win by genius alone. We could make the best fighter, but the Americans made the fighter that would win the war. The phrase summarizes the mismatch between two worldviews: the obsession with technical excellence versus the obsession with functional scale. The Mustang wasn't the best plane it could be. It was the best plane available. And that's why he won. In the next part, we will see how this ruthless logic descended from the skies to the roads and railways of the Reich. Because while the Luftwaffe was learning to respect the Mustang, the Allied armies were already preparing to use their air advantage to cripple Germany's logistical heartland. The enemy was no longer flying, and now he could no longer move. The collapse was not announced with explosions but with silence. By 1945, the Reich's airspace was no longer disputed. It was occupied. The Luftwaffe, once one of the most feared instruments of the German war machine, now existed only in the archives, the wreckage, and the memory of those who survived. There were no longer enough fighters, no experienced pilots, no fuel to fly. The runways were cratered, the hangars empty, the radios silent. Mustangs now crisscrossed the skies over Germany on almost ceremonial patrols, as sentinels of an inevitable victory. American air supremacy did not consolidate in an epic battle, but in the absence of any significant resistance. It was a victory by exclusion. There was no one left to fight. The most symbolic image of this new aerial age came on D-Day itself, June 6, 1944. While more than 14,000 Allied air sorties covered the Normandy landings, including bombers, fighters, gliders, and transport planes, the Luftwaffe managed to raise only 319 sorties. Of these, fewer than 100 involved fighter jets. And on the beaches, only 2 German fighter jets were visually confirmed. 2. For an operation that involved millions of soldiers, hundreds of ships, and one of the largest mobilizations in history, Nazi Germany's largest air force failed to even show its presence on its own territory. And that was more impactful than any direct confrontation. It was the emptiness that screamed. Mustangs, at this point, were not just fighters. They were markers of territory, visible signs that the air had changed hands. They flew reconnaissance missions, ground attack, bomber cover, and increasingly, independent sweeps to destroy any trace of German activity. Trains, trucks, depots, airfields, nothing escaped. It was the so-called empty air policy, hunting not just what flew, but everything that could support the flight. The Luftwaffe was not only shot down, it was dismantled, piece by piece, in a methodical and industrial process. The air war ceased to be a duel to become an execution. The statistics were definitive. By January 1945, fewer than 400 fighters were operational on the Western Front. The United States had more than 8,000 active aircraft in that same region, and the pace of production remained high. 72 Mustangs left American factories every working day. The Luftwaffe, at this point, could not even replace a fraction of that. Synthetic fuel, once a technological promise, was now a chronic problem. At many bases, planes were parked with empty tanks for weeks. Pilots were waiting for orders that didn't come, because there were no planes to fly, no more objectives to protect. The missions became symbolic, almost suicidal. Some veteran aces refused to fly, claiming it was a useless death. The collapse was not just material, it was moral. The German air doctrine, based on technical superiority and individual talent, failed in the face of the American logic of standardization and volume. While Germany designed sophisticated fighters that were difficult to maintain, the U.S. mass-produced simple, lethal, and easy-to-operate planes. And more importantly, they put these planes where they were needed, when they were needed. American air logistics were so efficient that many Mustangs had parts changed in the field in less than 2 hours. Mobile workshops accompanied the squadrons. Supply lines worked like clockwork. It was a war won on paper before it was won in heaven. General Galland, already removed from command of the Luftwaffe, would write in his memoirs, "We were not defeated in combat, we were defeated at the factory." And that phrase summed up the core of the German failure. Mustangs, with their autonomy, versatility, and constant presence, were the embodiment of American industrial superiority. It didn't matter how many FW-190s or Me-109s were still available. If there were no pilots, fuel, or parts, they were just carcasses with wings. In contrast, the Mustang flew, fought, won, and came back. Always. Throughout 1945, Germany's aerial landscape became ghostly. In cities such as Dresden, Leipzig, and Hamburg, it was possible to see German fighters abandoned on the runways, dusty, without ever having taken off. In Berlin, in the last month of the war, the Luftwaffe tried to react with improvised squadrons, including cadets and even members of the Hitler Youth. The result was predictable: mass slaughters, many without even reaching operational altitude. The sky, which had once been the stage of German technical arrogance, was now just a reminder of all that had been lost. In the next part, we will descend from this silent sky to the rails and roads of crumbling Germany. Because while the Mustangs dominated the skies, a new campaign, even more ruthless, began against the logistical backbone of the Reich. A war where each train shot down was one day less of resistance, where the sound of a 50 engine announced not only the death of the present, but the bankruptcy of the future. Modern warfare was no longer decided in the trenches or in last-minute tactical maneuvers. She made up her mind on the assembly lines. While Germany crumbled under the weight of its own industrial limits, the United States turned entire cities into war machines. Detroit didn't just make cars, it made bomber engines. Long Beach manufactured wings, tails, entire fuselages. In Dallas, workers worked non-stop shifts to assemble Mustangs that would be shipped by train or ship the same day they rolled off the line. In a scenario of ruins on the German side, America operated with mathematical precision. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were produced. Not prototypes, do not experiment. Combat-ready planes, delivered at a rate of 300 per month. No Axis country could keep up with this pace. Not even to understand. The Luftwaffe, which at the start of the war projected to have absolute air superiority based on the excellence of its pilots and the advanced design of its aircraft, was slowly swallowed up by an invisible enemy: scale. For every German fighter shot down, the replacement effort involved factories that had already been bombed, disrupted supply lines, shortages of rare metals, and increasingly inexperienced labor. For every Mustang shot down, another appeared on the production line the next day. Germany projected in months. The United States delivered in days. In 1944, while the Germans were training about 800 fighter pilots per month, the United States was training 11,000 aviators in the same period. Mathematics did not need combat. She had already won. The moral strength of the U.S. was also manifested in functional simplicity. Every Mustang was made to be easy to maintain, easy to operate, easy to replace. There was no room for technological luxuries disconnected from the reality of the countryside. The philosophy was clear: efficiency over sophistication. While German engineers struggled to adapt the Me-262 to unstable runways and low-quality fuel, the Americans were already testing engines for extreme climates, interchangeable parts between different models, and simplified avionics to speed up the training of newcomers. The P-51 was not just a fighter, it was a flying logistical system, and this system was fed by a national machine in perfect coordination. Behind the scenes, civilian companies that had once made refrigerators or vacuum cleaners now produced fairings, radios, tires, and even 50 ammunition for Mustangs. Each piece was designed to go into another, anywhere, under any condition. It was the victory of the standard over improvisation. The real fight was being won in Detroit, not Berlin. In process engineering, not on the front line, the Luftwaffe still flew bravely. But bravery doesn't replenish arsenals. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of German eyes from the beginning, and was ignored. Industrial power, scalable production, logistical adaptability. Instead of seeking sustainable quantity, the Reich sought punctual genius, and it reaped scarcity. If you're enjoying unraveling these little explored facts from history, show your support. Like and subscribe. This allows us to continue revealing the invisible gears behind the most decisive moments of the war. By the end of 1944, the gap was grotesque. The United States didn't just fly higher, farther, and more often. It flew with guaranteed replacement. It was possible, for example, that a Mustang pilot was shot down, rescued, and, 2 days later, was flying again in an airplane identical to the previous one, with the same armament, the same performance, and the same combat doctrine. German pilots, on the other hand, when they survived, returned to empty hangars or to old models patched up with parts from other destroyed aircraft. The Luftwaffe ceased to be an armed force to become a war patchwork. In January 1945, a British intelligence report estimated that only 12% of German aeronautical industrial capacity was still operational, and even this fraction operated under constant bombardment, with no secure line of supply. The United States, on the other hand, in that same month increased its monthly production by 7%, as if it were just warming up its engines. The enemy facing Germany was no longer an army. It was an entire continent functioning as a factory. In the next part, we will see how this industrial machine, now uncontrollable, begins to crush not only the skies but the German ground itself. Because when every road, every bridge, and every rail becomes accessible targets, war ceases to be tactical and becomes inevitable. The superiority in the skies did not erase the weight of what had to be done to conquer it. Inside the cramped cockpits of Mustangs, the glory of victory was lived out between shivering cold, constant muscle tension, and decisions that burned more than jet fuel. Each escort mission could last up to 8 hours. No pressurization, no heating. At temperatures that froze the riders' feet and toes, even with special boots. Many tied their fingers to the stick with strips of fabric so as not to lose it during involuntary spasms. The oxygen mask, covered in ice, made the air enter with pain. The cabin, shaken by vibrations and anxiety, became a flying cell of steel and sweat. Every minute, the possibility of nothingness. And yet, they flew. Robert Powell, a veteran pilot with the 357th Group, wrote years later, "I learned that winning sometimes means watching someone scream inside a burning plane and stay the course." That was the duality: impeccable technology, ruthless morals, and traumas that would never let the blood grow cold. The Mustangs escorted, attacked, won, but also buried. For each victory counted, there was a memory that did not fit in the reports. On patrols over Germany, it was common to see parachutes opening behind enemy lines. They were German pilots, shot down, saved. But not everyone was given this chance. In many situations, specific orders instructed pilots to attack targets on the ground without visible distinction. Trains that looked like supply trains sometimes carried civilians. Columns of vehicles were destroyed without confirmation of combat. Modern warfare was fast, relentless, and blind. One of the most critical points was the timing of the escort over industrial targets. Bombers flew in line, slow, accurate, and Mustangs roamed strict standards of protection. When a threat arose, pilots had fractions of a second to decide: maintain formation or pursue the enemy. To chase meant to break the pattern and leave a loophole. But hesitation could cost dozens of lives aboard a B-17. The tension of this calculation corroded the most experienced. Powell described the sound of the radio as a stream of anxious voices and trapped breaths that tried to sound like commands. War also took a psychological toll on repetition. Many pilots did 25, 30, even 40 missions before they were given any chance of rotation. It was like playing Russian roulette at every takeoff. And although the Mustangs were superior, superiority did not mean invulnerability. A 20mm shot, an engine failure, a navigation error, any detail could turn into condemnation. And even when everything went well, the landscape remained. The bombed German cities seen from above looked like urban corpses. The rivers were smoking. The columns of civilians crawled along the roads, fleeing something that came from the sky. And it was they, the pilots, who came. The triumph began to be confused with guilt. Major Don Blakesley, a squadron commander, was adamant. "We can win in numbers, but no number wipes away the smell of gunpowder that has stayed on me." The pilots, even when praised as heroes, carried on their backs not only the medals but the sleepless nights. Many, upon returning to the United States, abandoned aviation for good. Others kept silent for decades until the archives opened, and with them, the wounds. The war was not just a matter of air dominance. It was a prolonged exposure to the abyss, and to the constant doubt about how far one can go to win. The final irony was this: the men who piloted the ultimate symbol of American supremacy in the skies were also some of those who suffered the most from their weight. The Mustang, despite being an engineering miracle and a moral victory against Nazi arrogance, was also a machine that required human sacrifice on a quiet scale. Every victory had a cost, and the cost was not always visible on the war map. In the next part, we will observe the moment when even the German High Command recognizes the end, because while the Allied pilots returned exhausted, dirty, scarred, on the other side, there was no one willing to go up. And this absence would be, finally, the clearest confession that the war in the heavens was over. German ideology had promised dominance, technical purity, and an inevitable war of superiority. In the Luftwaffe's instruction rooms, young recruits were told that they would fly along the routes of eternal victory. The Reich would not only win, it would win with elegance, with Germanic precision, with aircraft that symbolized the unattainable genius of Aryan engineering. And for months it felt real. The skies of Europe were his hunting gallery. But then came the Mustang, and with it, the sound that was not in the manuals: silence. The arrival of the P-51s was not just a technical surprise, it was an emotional disruption. What Nazi manuals called clumsy American machines began to fly farther, higher, faster, and, the most unbearable, winning. The German pilots, trained to believe that their enemies were weak and inferior, began to lose to them in direct combat. The doctrine collapsed with each confrontation. It was no longer possible to sustain the illusion. Instead of hunters, they became survivors. Instead of invincible heroes, shadows inside vulnerable cockpits. Accounts preserved by German censors record the beginning of the moral fracture. One young pilot wrote, after his first mission against bombers escorted by Mustangs, "We were lied to. They are better, and they know it." This small line, hidden in a confiscated letter, represents what Nazi propaganda feared most: independent thinking, the perception that the enemy was organized, disciplined, strategically superior, and above all human, because what shocked was not just losing, but losing to someone who had been described as incapable. The doctrine said that Americans fought for money, for comfort, for propaganda, but the Mustangs kept coming, in waves, accurately, with morale, with sacrifice. The silence of German radios became commonplace. What was once a war of communications and inflammatory reports has turned into a sound desert. As Mustangs advanced and bombers reached the industrial heartlands of the Reich, many German outposts simply ceased to respond. It wasn't just the technical loss, it was the moral paralysis. Many officers knew they were defending a sky that no longer belonged to them. And even among the most fanatics, doubt set in, because the clouds no longer hid the enemy, only the truth that now fell like hail. There is a little-cited but devastating fact. In April 1945, more than 80% of Luftwaffe cadets reported symptoms of exhaustion, disorientation, or emotional refusal to fly. There was no longer enough training to convince them that there was still something to protect. A greater symbol had been overturned: cultural invincibility. And when a culture stops believing in itself, the fight becomes an empty routine. Even among the surviving aces, words began to change. Adolf Galland, once a symbol of German air pride, would write in his diary, "The Luftwaffe no longer believes in its own propaganda. Reality has stripped us bare." This collapse was not caused by a single plane. It was caused by the idea that the other side could think better, produce more, adapt faster. The Mustang was just the visible face of a civilization that did not fight for myths, but for method, and that was what hurt the most. Germany taught that war was won by purity, race, and bravery. The heavens said something else. The war was won by logistics, science, and strategic humility. And this lesson, for many German soldiers, was unbearable. Luftwaffe bases began to record not only casualties but technical desertions. Mechanics disappeared. Officers asked for transfer to rear posts. Reports began to be filled with euphemisms such as operational problems, when in fact what there was emotional breakdown. The Reich Air Force fell not only by the pressure of the enemy, but by the weight of its own lie, because in the end, the Mustang that flew over Berlin carried more than ammunition. He carried a message. The world had changed, and the one who mocked this change was the first to be forgotten. In the next part, We will see how this moral collapse echoed in the post-war period, when German veterans themselves began to study, with silent admiration, the machine that closed their skies. Before the Mustang, fighters were seen as guard dogs, armed, fast, but essentially reactive. They defended targets, protected bombers for a limited time, fought only within their own geographical boundaries. They were, in essence, short-lived machines. But when the P-51 came along and began escorting bombers into Germany's industrial heartland, and more importantly, back with them, an entire doctrine was dismantled. For the first time, a fighter was no longer local and became strategic. The concept of Air Force projection had just been born. It was no longer just firepower that mattered, but range, efficiency, the ability to sustain combat in hostile territory for hours. That changed everything, because from then on, defeating the enemy didn't just mean intercepting. It meant reaching him before he even had a chance to act. The Mustang was more than an airplane. It was a flying doctrine. His legacy has crossed borders and decades. In the Korean War, the F-86 Sabre would inherit the logic of range and aerodynamic efficiency. In Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom would take this idea into the supersonic age. And today, the F-35, with its advanced sensors, extended autonomy and ability to operate away from traditional bases, still carries in the silence of the digital cockpit the echo of that 1944 transformation. The Americans did not invent the fighter, but they were the first to understand it as a vector of prolonged, sustained, and adaptable domination. What's more, Mustang taught that you don't win only with technology, but with an ecosystem that sustains that technology. Logistics, production, training, and interoperability. Behind every Mustang were entire factories operating in continuous shifts, transatlantic supply lines, engineers overhauling every component, and pilots being trained on a scale that Germany could never imitate. While the Luftwaffe bet on lone aces, the U.S. bet on systems. The Mustang was just the spearhead of an organization that understood war as a continuous flow of capability. This reasoning, that of war as a long-term industrial project, became the basis for the entire post-war air strategy, and those who underestimated him lost. The USSR, upon observing the performance of the P-51, accelerated its own long-range fighter designs. NATO began to base its defenses not on planes stationed in the rear, but on warning fighters that could cross continents, and even the enemies of the future, such as China, when designing their new generations of aircraft, study, even today, what was done in 1944. Because the central idea remains, it is not the fighter that wins a war, it's what comes along with it. And perhaps that was the most bitter lesson for the Germans. They had excellent planes, some even revolutionary, but they didn't have the set. The Mustang taught that modern air warfare belongs to those who think deeply, those who design, those who maintain, those who sustain. It changed the air not just physically, but conceptually. A plane that, as it flew from London to Berlin and back, didn't just escort bombers. It escorted the future. In the next and final part, we will see what this aerial victory represented for memory, for morale, and for the lesson that history has left not only for soldiers, but for every civilization that one day dares to underestimate what it does not understand. Because, as we'll see, Mustang's last victory wasn't in the sky, it was in the memory. 4 months after laughing at staggering unprotected bombers, Luftwaffe pilots were looking up at the same sky and seeing something that shouldn't have been there. A single engine, fast, persistent, relentless, and American fighter. What the Germans called turkey shooting turned into their own aerial collapse. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers to Berlin. He exposed, with surgical precision, the systemic error of a power that believed it could win by doctrine, ignoring industrial reality.